Welcome, and thank you for joining us here today to discuss how to mobilize global finance to expand clean energy markets. My name is Helen Mountford, and I'm Vice President of Climate and Economics at the World Resources Institute, and I'll be moderating this session today. First, I'd like to start by thanking the Chilean Ministry of Energy for their work in hosting this year's Clean Energy Ministerial CEM 12. Thank you very much. I am delighted to be here today on behalf of World Resources Institute as we launch new research with our partner Ørsted, the world's largest offshore wind company. Our new work looks at how we can unlock a renewable energy future using government policies and action to drive private investment. Today's topic of discussion is on this, and it is critically important. We know that the energy transition is inevitable, but needs to be accelerated. A recent WRI report on the state of climate action indicated we need to ramp up renewables about 5 times or more faster than what we've seen in recent years. So we need to accelerate this. We know we have the money needed to achieve the energy transition around the world, and we know that both the private sector and the governments will need to play a crucial part to scale renewables. Yet this still isn't happening in many markets. Why and how can we get where we need to be? These are some of the questions we'll be answering today. At the same time, as we see this happening, countries, sectors, and companies are already in a race to zero emissions, and we are seeing other races to mobilize finance. For example, the International Solar Alliance is scaling solar investment to $1 trillion. How do we harness these kinds of initiatives further? Again, something we'll be discussing today. For our event today, we've got a fantastic lineup of speakers. We'll be hearing from Undersecretary Francisco Javier Lopez, representing the Chilean Ministry of Energy. We'll hear from Danish Climate Ambassador Thomas Anker Christensen, from Dr. Ajay Mathur, the Director General of the International Solar Alliance, from Philippe Engel, Vice President of Sustainability, Public Affairs, and Branding at Ørsted, and from Jennifer Lakey, Global Director of Energy at WRI. Now, first, I'm delighted to be joined here today by Undersecretary Francisco Javier Lopez. Not only have we benefited from his and Chile's leadership here at CEM, but also from his continuous support in the P4G partnership, that is the Partnering for Green Growth and the Global Goals 2030 partnership. It brings together public-private partnerships to advance climate and the Sustainable Development Goals. WRI is very honored to host that partnership. Now, I invite you, Undersecretary Lopez, to make welcoming remarks. Over to you, Undersecretary.
Thank you, Helen. It is my pleasure to be here today participating on this panel and share the stage with you, and especially with Mr. Thomas Anker Christensen, Dr. Ajay Mathur, Mrs. Jennifer Lake, Mr. Philip Engel, Mrs. Elvia Ganum, and all the people that is participating on this stage. And also, as Chile, we are delighted that we are the host of the 12th Clean Energy Ministerial meeting at the 6th Mission Innovation Ministerial, giving us the opportunity to have the discussion we will see today. Both ministerial meetings are the most important international summits on clean energy and innovation of this year's 2021, aiming to accelerate the global clean energy transition. Through this week, over 60 events are taking place, boosting the commitment, cooperation, and dialogue among the world's largest economies in their respective energy transition process, in light of the turning point of the energy sector that COP26 presents in the context of broader and more ambitious climate actions. I would like to take this opportunity to thank all the institutions and organizations that have gathered this week for the discussion, and with a special thanks to the organizer of this event. Today, the World Resources Institute has invited us to realize the importance of accelerated investment in renewables, which are needed for assessing the climate crisis and for the recovery in the economic crisis that we are experiencing today. Thank you for this invitation to have this discussion and for being a panelist today.
Thank you very much, Undersecretary Lopez. I am also thrilled to be here with my longtime friend and colleague, Thomas Anker Christensen, Climate Ambassador for Denmark. Denmark co-leads the investment and finance track of the Clean Energy Ministerial and is also one of the key partners in P4G as well. We are so glad that you're able to help us open today's session and provide some reflections from your work on finance and leadership in shifting Denmark to a clean energy economy. So now I invite you, Thomas, to make your opening remarks. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Helen, and thank you very much, Undersecretary Lopez, for inviting us to participate here and for Chile's leadership in hosting the SEM. I will focus my remarks on the money, follow the money, as the saying goes, and on how unlocking green finance will be the key to our chances for winning the climate emergency race. I will focus on the risk, the opportunity, and some of the challenges we're facing and which SEM could be instrumental in looking at. Risk first. Climate change is real and poses a grave risk for business, industry, and investors all over the world. It's both a real physical risk on assets and investments, and there's also a real risk that assets strand if companies are not able to adapt their business models in due time to a world where policies, technologies, and consumer behavior all are becoming greener. Climate risk is one of the reasons why private investors are increasingly looking towards sustainable green investments and financial products. SEM, investment and finance track, can be instrumental in highlighting this risk. The opportunity. With decreasing costs of renewables, sustainable investments are no longer only a matter of doing the right thing or mitigating climate risk. They also make good financial sense in their own right. COVID-19 has even highlighted this trend. During the pandemic, stocks that take into account environmental, social, and governance factors have generally outperformed the rest of the market. The right thing to do has become the smart thing to do. Over the next decade, massive investments are needed to limit the global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius. These are funds that cannot be raised by governments alone. We also need private investments and public-private partnerships. To mobilize private green investments, governments have to help mitigate investor risks. At SEM, we can do that by focusing on setting ambitious climate and energy targets, by creating the right framework conditions for renewable energy, and by ensuring long-term energy planning and transparent energy market regulation. To do that effectively, governments and private investors and companies have to collaborate to remove barriers and grab the opportunities, both when it comes to creating enabling policy frameworks and building new business models. So what are some of the challenges that we also need to address? First, let me mention fossil investments. Accelerating clean energy investments will not do the job alone. In order to win the battle against climate change, we have to phase out fossil fuels at a much faster pace than the market is currently implying. This means using investment and finance actively to change behavior. That's why Denmark has decided to end oil and gas production in the North Sea by 2050. And we are already well underway to phase out coal completely in our energy mix. We will be fully phased out of energy generation by coal by 2028 at the latest. Internationally, we are also actively engaged in a dialogue with a range of countries to accelerate coal phase out through a more rapid energy transition. And it is a Danish key priority that multilateral development banks define a common framework for Paris alignment. This includes ending all support to fossil fuels and excluding all investments which cannot be considered Paris aligned. And finally, we are in the process of phasing out export financing for fossils, have already decided to move ahead on coal power and thermal coal mining and transportation. The other challenge, and I'm so glad that Ajay Mathur and Ørsted will be speaking later in this session, is the one faced by emerging and developing economies. These markets have a key role to play in the energy transformation. And despite the fact that renewable energy costs have fallen rapidly and wind and solar power are often cheaper than fossil fuels, it still proves difficult to catalyze investments in these markets. You could say that there is a market failure and an investment gap. Investors tend to conclude that investments in these markets are more complex, more difficult, more risky. There's policy uncertainty, insufficient regulatory frameworks, lack of local capacities, and infrastructure lock-in within locally based power systems. These are hurdles which countries need to solve to be capable of attracting private investments and finance at large scale. Our Danish experience show that de-risking through the creation of an enabling environment is an essential building block in promoting least cost development of renewable energy. That's why we are collaborating with 16 of the world's largest economies, covering more than 60% of global emissions, on energy transition, most of them being emerging economies, and India is one of them, where Mr. Mathur comes from. The programs have been designed in collaboration with these countries and depend on the national context and needs, but the overall objective is the same: to share experiences and best practice on how to create enabling frameworks for renewable energy and energy efficiency. Technical assistance and capacity building are key, so that we can contribute to paving the way for future clean energy investments at scale. So in conclusion, in the wake of the pandemic, we all have to invest in restarting our economies. That's a golden opportunity to kickstart the green transition, reset the markets, and catalyze us on the way to net zero. It is our hope that at SEM, both countries, companies, and investors will seize this opportunity. Thank you very much, Helen.
Thank you so much, Thomas, Ambassador Christensen. Wonderful to hear both what Denmark is doing at home, but also how you're working together with 16 of the largest economies on that energy transition. Now, I have a couple of follow-up questions for both yourself and for Undersecretary Lopez. So first, just to frame this, despite being in the middle of the first wave of the pandemic, last year, Chile released its own new nationally determined contribution, its 2030 climate targets, updated and enhanced, really cementing Chile's status as an international leader on climate and setting a standard for other countries to follow on a green recovery. And now, as the host of SEM, Chile is proving that it's serious about accelerating that energy transition itself. Denmark, of course, has long put climate at the top of its agenda with ambitious national targets, a strong approach recently to shifting away from oil and gas exploration. And I understand you're planning to spend as much as 60% of the EU COVID crisis funds on climate measures within Denmark. So government stimulus in the wake of the COVID crisis is one of the ways that we're seeing as part of an economic recovery that we really have an opportunity to reshape investment toward renewable energy and really shift the economy forward towards a more inclusive, jobs-rich, and clean economy. We know we can generate as much as double the amount of jobs for the same investments in renewable energy as we would make in coal, oil, or gas. You get double the jobs for investing in renewable energy and energy efficiency in many cases. So the question is, are we scaling this rapidly enough? And if not, how best can government investment really help to catalyze the change? Let me start off by asking you both, first, as governments channel funds into stimulus packages, as we're seeing this continuing around the world, how do you see this moment can be used as a catalyst to really scale renewables? Let me start with you, Undersecretary Lopez, and then I'll pass over to Thomas.
Thank you. The Ministry of Energy, along with other public institutions in Chile and the private sector, has fostered and designed a plan for reaching carbon neutrality by 2050. Our plan is extremely ambitious, but in a sense is simple: to clean our electricity generation capacity by increasing the amount of renewable energy. Our aim is to achieve 70% renewable energy before 2030. The withdrawal of coal-fired power plants by 2040. The promotion of energy efficiency, mainly in construction vehicles, appliance, and industry equipment. To replace fossil fuels with electricity across different sectors of the economy, to prompt investment in transmission, storage, and digitalization, and to replace fossil fuels with electricity. This investment is not just an opportunity for Chile, and as we are currently accelerating the recovery through the energy sector, and it is private investment in renewables. According to the CBC, immediately after the lockdown established in Chile, the energy sector jumped to first position in investments. And during the second half of 2020, energy sector maintained the second place just after mining. Chile is able to catalyze the investment in the energy transition after the huge and low-cost renewable energy potential as we have the most powerful solar radiation on the planet and the consistent onshore winds. It has been mapped more than 1.8 thousand gigawatts in renewable energy, renewable electricity generation potential, which accounts for more than 7 times the current installed capacity of our country. Moreover, the robust institution we hold today, the transparent and non-discriminatory regulation in the energy sector, and the advanced energy markets are enabled to renewable to scale. In that sense, the 2020 Climate Scope by Bloomberg Net recognized Chile as the most attractive country for investment in renewable energies, with an inflow of over $14,000 million investment in renewable energy, based our determination to transition to a cleaner matrix.
Thank you so much, Undersecretary Lopez, and I think others can learn from the example there in Chile on that ambitious path as you're recovering from the COVID crisis, but also really shifting investments towards renewables and becoming such an attractive spot for investing in renewables. Let me pass over to you, Thomas. Reflections on the COVID economic recovery and how to ensure we use this as a moment to really boost the shift towards renewables.
Thank you, Helen. Well, what we did in Denmark was not to treat the green dimension of recovery as an add-on or as something separate, but we integrated it into our core economic planning with the Minister of Finance, Minister of Taxation, and of course the Minister for Climate and Energy and Minister for Business, all working together in a whole of government approach. So in the middle of lockdown last year, we adopted the climate law, setting a stretch target of 70% emission reduction by 2030 on a 1990 baseline. And then with that law in hand, the government launched into political negotiations in Parliament, leading to political agreement on how to achieve the 70% target within industry, energy, transport, buildings. We're still negotiating on agriculture and taxation, but basically sector by sector, again, not as an add-on, but as actually as the key financial instrument of driving government policy sectorally. And this was done in close cooperation with the Danish private sector, with Danish investors. And just actually last Friday, it was agreed that we should reach 50% reduction already in 2025. So we are pushing the ambition on a continued base, reviewing our policies and frameworks for doing so. As part of this, there's already an agreement to build 2 new energy islands, one in the North Sea, one in the Baltic, with an extra capacity of 10 gigawatt. That means that we will more than double our energy supply, with a view to having enough energy to export to our neighbors and to produce green hydrogen, to do the transition in industry and transport those sectors that you cannot power with 220 volt electricity alone. So we are not only planning for the 70%, we're already planning for the business case for going beyond that. A bit like I heard Francisco for Chile. I mean, the way you are investing in solar in Chile, we are investing in wind in Denmark because we believe in the business case for the green economy.
Thank you so much, Thomas, and inspiring to hear how you're continuing to ramp up the climate ambition there as you find these new opportunities for investment and accelerating action as part of the economic recovery directly, integrated, not as an add-on, but integrated directly in the recovery efforts. Thank you. One follow-up question, first for Undersecretary Lopez and then for yourself. Undersecretary Lopez, how has Chile worked with the private sector as part of this to really increase adoption of renewable energy? How have you engaged the private sector?
Thank you, Helen. Chile has presented an ambitious challenge with the private sector with the coal phase-out plan, and this technology supplies about 30% of our generation mix. In 2019, we signed an agreement with the companies that own these facilities to retirement by 2040. But we are seeing every year these companies moving forward several years their retirement dates. So we expected that the entire core installed capacity will be retired sooner than 2040. By the end of this year, 2021, we will have retired almost 30% of the coal capacity we have on 2019. And as we announced recently in April, we will retire 50% of the coal capacity by 2050. Also, the energy sector has maintained its investment momentum through the pandemic, and moreover, it had registered its second best quarterly investment intensity in the last 13 years. Peaking at more than $1.6 million in the $1,000 million in the last quarter of 2020. This year, we have more than 130 new projects under construction, focused on the production of non-conventional renewable energies, which together accumulate around 6 gigawatts, leading to an increase of the installed capacity of the grid of more than 20%. It's important to notice that 60% of these projects are solar plants and 36% are wind power plants, which are expected to be operative by 2022. Today, the retirement plan of these coal power plants will come with a replacement with renewable energy, and it's the most profitable source of energy for private investor and even society. If we look into the economic in Chile, if you are considering developing a power plant, the most cost-effective technologies are presented by companies are renewable.
Thank you so much, Undersecretary. And very briefly, Thomas, one final question for you. How can the experiences from Denmark be helpful to other countries in terms of unlocking private sector investment?
Two very brief comments on that. Number one, the need to de-risk energy investments through clear and long-term policies and frameworks. That's the government role. And then number two, to involve the private sector in the long-term planning. We have established 13 public-private partnerships with each sector in the Danish economy. On the private side, led by the foremost CEO in the sector, say Ørsted leads the work on energy, Maersk on shipping, and then working with the industry to set the frameworks, to develop the policies, and to scale the solutions in Denmark, but then we try to take it to European and global level in close cooperation.
Thank you so much. And thank you again, Undersecretary Lopez and Ambassador Christensen, for the excellent insights relevant to so many, sharing the true ambition that we're seeing from Chile and from Denmark on this energy transition. Thank you. Now, after hearing from the SEM leadership on how they are adapting to a changing world, I'd love to turn now to talk about the private sector. We know that financing a clean energy future isn't just possible. The funding is already starting to shift in the right direction. We're seeing investments starting to shift. Just a few weeks ago at the Leaders Climate Summit, a new coalition was announced, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, otherwise known as GFANZ. This brings together the asset owners, the asset managers, and banks that have all committed now to achieve net zero across their portfolios and investments by 2050, and to set in place intermediate targets to achieve this. Altogether, these institutions have over $70 trillion in assets which they are managing or investing. So the world's biggest financial players are shifting rapidly away from fossil fuels and going towards a trajectory for net zero emissions. So what do we need to do now to get more of those funds invested in renewables? That's what we'll be discussing. It's time for governments to help create an enabling environment to align with the finance sector actors that are already pledging to fund this race for zero. So how do we create the right investment pathways? We're going to talk about that now with some practical steps. I'm delighted to turn first to Dr. Ajay Mathur. Ajay, this topic, scaling the pathways for clean energy investment, is something that you're very much focused on in your new role as Director General of the International Solar Alliance. Your goal is to mobilize $1 trillion of investment in solar by 2030, with the aim of ensuring affordable, reliable, sustainable energy for all. This is no small feat, but absolutely essential. WRI has been thrilled to partner with the International Solar Alliance on this objective. The question to you is, can you tell us a little bit about how you see intergovernmental organizations helping to support governments and the private sector to develop these investment pathways? Over to you, Ajay.
Helen, first of all, it's an absolute delight to join you and all other colleagues in this SEM meeting. You're absolutely right. We are at a time in history when investments in renewables, away from fossil fuels, are changing the nature of the energy business, and nowhere more than in electricity. We are at a time when we want every country in the world to focus on solar, enhance the prioritization that is provided to solar across the economy, politically, economically, from the basis of the lending that is done, so that we achieve the $1 trillion in solar investments by 2030 that we are looking at. But in the process, also create the kinds of infrastructures that, for example, Ambassador Christensen was talking about, the kinds of processes, policies, which are there for a longer period of time and give people the confidence to invest in it. Helen, you've been coordinating the work of the new climate economy for a long time. And I don't think that it is any news to you that obviously, as you make this transition happen, as you make any transition happen, there are three kinds of financial buckets which matter. The first is the transaction itself, investing in solar. And obviously, if somebody invests in solar, they would expect to get a rate of return. So if you put in 100 euros over the life of the project, 15 years, 20 years, 25 years, you would like to come out with, say, 125 or 150 or whatever it is. But in order to make this happen, you need the second ring of finance. Let me call it the second concentric ring, which is the risk management part. This could be a payment guarantee mechanism. It could be a subsidy in countries where people don't have the ability to pay. It could be policies that provide the certainty that the returns would come in. In other words, a set of concentric financing around the base transaction financing. So that's the second. But these are both project specific. Now, nobody's going to invest a lot of risk capital money only for one project. You would like to see a second, you'd like to see a third, you'd like to see a fifth, a 10th, 100th. And that is where the third part of financing comes in, which is in the readiness part. You need the people who can make the projects. You need the regulators who can give it the conditions under which it will earn a return. You need the policymakers who can ensure its replication. You need the bankers who can help in doing the risk assessments. In other words, we need to bring these three groups together. The problem is the commercial transactions are done by one set of individuals, typically funds. The risk mitigation is done by a second set of individuals, typically bilaterals and multilaterals. And the readiness is done either by multilaterals or by philanthropic money. You need all of the three to sit down together, particularly to jumpstart the financing in areas, in sectors where it has not taken off. The point was discussed, and I thank both Undersecretary Lopez and Ambassador Christensen for bringing it out. There are large parts of the world where this is not coming together. We need to make it happen. So I think the first thing that the world needs is for these three different sources of financing to come together. And in particular, we need to have both the national actions as well as the international actions to create the risk mitigation structures that are needed so that we are comfortable and so are others. Now, how these will be designed will be different. You know, how they will occur in sub-Saharan Africa will be different from the SIDS in the least developed countries, will be different from the other developing countries. But at the end of the day, what the Solar Alliance seeks to do is to provide the information that is needed. You know, solar is an area where we are getting updates every day. So what we would like to do is to bring an update every year so that when a country or a company establishes a program, they can use the latest information that's available. We would like to help create the capacity I talked of the policy capacity, but also the banking capacity, the regulatory capacity, the capacity that is needed for many such projects to be built, many such projects to be operationalized, to be implemented. And finally, in many, many countries, you need to actually push through the first project. So particularly in LDCs and SIDS, we need to create the conditions which make it viable for processes to be established, whether it's on the financing side, whether it's on the policy side, so that we have one project after the other, so that you can replicate it. But you need a project to make it happen. It is these three kinds of things that I think is important for us as the Solar Alliance, and more importantly, I think for us as the world, to enable the transition towards cleaner energy and ensure that the global finance that we are talking about is pulled into this sector.
The three different sources of financing that are needed so urgently now, the three actors who need to work together to do so, and what this means for different types of countries, so that all countries are ready to mobilize the investments needed for a clean energy future. Thank you so much for that. Now we need to focus on the ways we can remove some of the institutional and regulatory barriers and unlock the markets for investment to come in. We're now going to hear from colleagues in Ørsted, the world's leader on offshore wind energy. So I'm pleased to be able to introduce Philip Engel, who's Ørsted's Vice President of Sustainability, Public Affairs and Branding, and also my colleague Jennifer Lakey, WRI's Global Director of Energy. Jennifer and Philip are here today to release a brand new report, Unlocking a Renewable Energy Future, How Government Action Can Drive Private Investment. This paper comes at a critical moment for the energy transition. I'm going to pass over to Jennifer to kick off a fireside chat style discussion between herself and Philip on the paper and the results there. So Jennifer, over to you to start us off with what you can share in terms of what you've learned and what you hope policymakers will take away from this report. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen, and thank you to all of the speakers today. Wonderful to be here and so pleased to have the opportunity to share some of the initial findings and recommendations from this new research that we're publishing. So first, let me just say that the important points made by the other speakers, I will echo in this summary. First, we are recommending that policies and market rules be modified very rapidly in order to improve the investment case for the private sector. This includes future-proofing the grid, as well as looking at contracting mechanisms that can allow for the important investments to come forward. And as Dr. Mathur noted, that's not simply in finding the investors, that's also in creating the investment environment that will allow, as he said, for 3 rings of investment to come in forward. And that includes in building rings around the primary investment to ensure that you do have the ability to navigate and manage risk, and that there are opportunities for readiness that allow for these investments to be successful through the market conditions that exist in countries. The second area of our recommendations in the report is around ensuring that there are a recognition for the local conditions and a build out of the solutions that can match those local conditions. This is an important part of the agenda because it recognizes that it is not only countries that have received the bulk of the investment today that need this investment going forward. We look at the important strategies that have countries like Chile have put forward, countries like India have put forward in terms of solar scaling, and you note that there are some very critical elements associated with the build out of the maturity of those markets, helping to create pathways for investment that wouldn't have existed 10 to 15 years ago. And the third area of our recommendations is around public and stakeholder engagement in planning processes and the ability to think about early and sustained engagement with stakeholders who are coming to this clean energy transition from a variety of different important areas of their own work, balancing the needs. How do you think about the fishermen? How do you think about the the agricultural community, the farmers? How do we think about our choices associated with land use, the ecosystem needs, and where and how we look at local land tenure in our decision making? So policymakers have to think forward a decade, 2 decades, and think about where and how we're going to build out the capacity to manage for stakeholder involvement and engagement as we build out this clean energy future. So please ensure that we are looking at these as 3 critical areas in order to scale investment. It's not just the dollars, it's the surrounding environment, these pathways that we spoke about, that Dr. Matura referenced as well, in terms of readiness for finance. That will allow the private sector to come in. And I'm so pleased that we've been able to do this research and look at this with our partner, Ørsted. Ørsted has been on this journey itself, and I'm so excited to have with us one of our partners from Ørsted, Philip Engel, who is the Vice President of Sustainability, Public Affairs and Branding from Ørsted, to help us launch this report today and to speak about the private sector experience. It's so important to hear in their sustainability journey where and how Ørsted has encountered these readiness questions, these investment questions, and the importance of stakeholder engagement. Let me just note that I have been an admirer of Ørsted because they have invested in places around the world where we need this scaling. The United States, for example, they're actually looking at how to help create jobs alongside policymakers. What do you need to do to train people for the clean energy future, and wind in particular? So I'm delighted, Philip, to be here in this fireside chat context with you. And let me just say, as we start this discussion, that we really would love to hear about what inspired you all, a developer, to work across continents and to build out both your business practice and also the government engagement approaches that will allow these investments to come forward and help to reflect the private sector experience in this energy transition.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. First, I want to thank Under Secretary Lopez for hosting with Chile, Clean Energy Ministerial, and for hosting this event. And thank you to the other speakers who made some really insightful remarks here. And perhaps, Jennifer, just 2 words about what actually made us want to collaborate with you at World Resources Institute on this paper. And I think it was really that notion of there is something of a paradox here in a way. You know, we are in a position where a lot of the solutions, a lot of the energy technologies, they are actually there to make the transition to green energy, at least on the production side. You also have a lot of the capital available, at least it's there, it's out there, it's actually looking for return on investment. And so you have some of the fundamentals in place, yet the transition to green energy, to clean energy from fossil fuels is not happening fast enough. We all know the figures. We need to reduce globally the emissions by 50% towards 2030, and 73% of those emissions, they actually come from the use of energy. So how do we do that? And there's a lot of reasons for why that is not happening, because the technologies, as I said, they're there, and finance is also out there. And so what are all those institutional barriers? What are those policy mechanisms that are not in place for it to happen? And we wanted to explore that further, and what better partner than you guys to do that with.
Thank you. Well, I'm curious about how your own journey began. And could you speak a little bit to, you were a fossil fuel intensive energy company, one of the largest in oil. How did this sustainability journey begin with Ørsted? And then what would that mean for your private sector colleagues in terms of not only making this a question of where and how you develop projects, but how do you develop your business case for this internally?
Right. Yeah, that's a pretty big question, of course. And I'll try to give a relatively short answer. So our transformation started a bit more than a decade ago. And back then, we were one of the most fossil fuels intensive energy companies in Europe. And today, we are one of the global leaders in green energy development. So it started with a basic insight that our business model was not sustainable. It was not sustainable to continue to build and operate especially coal-fired power plants, and we wanted to change that. We could see that especially the climate change was on the rise, and we expected that our business environment would change as a consequence of that, that we would see much more regulation and much more demand for green energy. And also, we also wanted to do the right thing. But of course, you can't just only do the right thing. You also have to be able to run a business based on that. So it's about doing business while doing good. And I think what is necessary, I think, to do is, as a business, is really to look at the fundamentals you're facing, how your business environment is going to change and will change because of climate change. And that realization is really the starting point. And I think that's very important, not to expect that changes will just be incremental. Changes will be very much exponential. And that's also what we've seen. And I think to start with that point of departure and lean in to that future and really start to take some of those bets that enable you to transform your business, that is what it really requires. And to us, that was to put basically all our money on offshore wind, which back then was quite immature technology, and to lean forward and do everything we could to develop that technology to now be the cornerstone of our business. We also have solar, and we also have onshore wind. That's really also a growing business for us. But our transformation has really been fueled by building an offshore wind business. Let me just give you a figure. Today, we have the same people, a bit more than a decade. Over a decade, we've changed it. So today we have the same number of people who work in our offshore wind business as we had who worked in our coal-fired power plants business a bit more than a decade ago. So that's a good way of seeing how that transformation has happened.
I think that's a wonderful statistic to be able to say that you have the same number of jobs. They're just different jobs. And I know that for many governments, this question associated with the transition, it does come down to people and economic development, and how do you manage and navigate that? And I wanted to just, as we close, note a few of the things that our colleagues have already mentioned in the conversations with Ambassador Christensen and with Undersecretary Lopez around the importance of those targets, importance of changing the fossil fuel subsidies that were in place in countries that enabled the development pathway to continue to build out fossil fuel. And then the importance of these really significant longer-term view and planning processes in order to begin to think about that shift as something that, as Dr. Mathur said, you could build a readiness for the shift itself. That, I think, is an important part of the messaging that comes forward in the report and that we've heard here today in the event. So thank you very much for your partnership and for these very specific recommendations and the engagement with policymakers going forward. We're heading towards COP. The Clean Energy Ministerial is a critical community, and we're excited to begin to take this forward into actionable commitments by other countries and leaders. So back over to you, Helen, as we move through the last segment of our agenda today.
Thank you so much, Philip and Jennifer, and congratulations on the launch of the report. It's really important insights that you've shared there from Ørsted, from the report, to really bring this conversation to light. So thank you so much. Now we'd like to hear experience from scaling in other markets. So finally, I'm very pleased that we have with us Elbia Ghanum, CEO of the Brazilian Wind Energy Association and Vice Chair of the Global Wind Energy Council, or GWEC. Elbia, you have both local governmental and global experience. We've been working together for some time on the Ocean Renewable Energy Action Coalition, in which our friends at Ørsted have also been involved. We're very excited to see that the Global Wind Energy Council recently launched a global sprint for offshore wind ambition, which aims to help governments set concrete targets by COP26. The sprint will provide the technical and advisory support that governments need to help them raise ambition and remove barriers to the massive scaling up of investments in offshore wind. So let me start with a question for you, Elbia. You've been working on scaling wind energy in Brazil for a very long time. How do the lessons from this new report fit with your experiences in Brazil? And in your experience, how can associations help governments to bridge this investment gap? Over to you, Elbia. Thank you.
Yes, first of all, thank you very much for invitation. I'd like to say congratulations for Chile and the Secretary Lopez. Yes, let's to talk about the investment in Brazil renewable. And it's very important to highlight that Brazil is a very, very renewable country when you talk about the energy and electricity. We have a very high grade in energy and electricity in our metrics. Brazil is really renewable. So when you're talking about the investments for the future, made in this context of economic, low carbon economy, we can see that we have a good experience with onshore wind made in the last 10 years. We started investments and we had 1 gigawatts in the last 10 years, but in the last 10 years, we increased this a lot. And nowadays, wind onshore is the second source in our electricity metrics. And this increase has been mainly because we have a very good source and very competitive. Recently, we started to discuss about to improve investments for offshore wind. And for this, we have a big challenge, but we have a good learning about the wind onshore, and we believe that this experience can give the way to improve investments in offshore wind. We have some challenges to face, mainly when you're talking about regulatory framework. We need to arrange this regulatory framework for receiving investments. Nowadays, we can see the competitiveness challenge because onshore wind, solar, and the others renewable sources is very cheap here. And we need to reduce costs for offshore wind in order to start with this project here. And the third one is our marketing, because the crisis and because other crises Brazil needed to face in the last 6 or 7 years. And we don't have them enough for a lot of projects as we have today. For this reason, we need to work and prepare our structure economic to attract investments in offshore wind. So I believe that we have a good opportunity, and it is very important to the government prepare this environment. Then I would say that we have a very important homework here, that is prepare a friendly environment for investment. And for this reason, I have been working and talk with authorities, with policymakers, in order to prepare this environment. Of course, this environment has to establish a regulatory framework, especially for offshore wind. We have a very good regulatory framework for other sectors, and looking for attract good investors to reduce costs and work in order to increase the investments here and the increase in GDP and the become economy more attractive for investors and for developing. I believe that this is the main point.
Elbia, and thank you for sharing the experience there in Brazil, which has really led to such strong leadership on wind energy, but also what you're continuing to do to work with the government, work with others to ensure the right investment environment to attract the investments you need to scale up clean energy even further. So thank you so much for sharing those. And thank you to all of our speakers. We've had many insights in our session today about how governments can and must ensure that countries are investment ready, how the private sector must be incentivized to develop the portfolios of viable projects and clean energy and renewables, and how investors must have visibility into these pathways in order that they can channel funds appropriately. So I want to conclude with first just one very brief question, just 30 seconds each, to each of our panelists on one word of advice that you would offer to the ministers present at the 12th Clean Energy Ministerial. So let me start with Thomas, then Ajay, then Albia, then Philip, and then we'll finish with some closing remarks after that from Undersecretary Lopez. So what would be your one piece of advice to ministers at the SEM? Thomas, over to you.
Now is the time to grab the opportunity to build back better and greener. That is to catalyze the green transformation at global scale by ambition and action commensurate with the 1.5-degree challenge, but also then reaping the economic, social, and climate benefits of being a front runner. Green is good for economy and good for business.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Thomas. Now let me pass to Ajay. Ajay, your one piece of advice for the ministers.
Helen, I'm going to cheat and mention two. The first, of course, is something that I focused on, which is creating a risk mitigation framework that enables money to flow into countries where it is not flowing in today. And the second is create the kind of demand. And the best way to do it is cross-border trade. Develop the kinds of linkages between, say, India and West Asia, or between Europe and North Africa, or between Australia and Singapore. This enables a lot of investment to occur in countries where it makes sense to invest in solar energy.
Thank you so much, Ajay. And over to Albia. Albia, your one piece of advice to the ministers.
Brazil has a good, maybe unique opportunity to attract investments from foreign and domestic capital. What's important? It is very important to prepare our business environment and to make this a friendly environment to attract investors. This is the point.
Thank you, Albia. And finally, over to Philippe. What's your one piece of advice to the ministers meeting here?
Helen, tackling climate change is not actually a technological problem. It's not really an economical problem either, a financial problem. It's a leadership problem. That's my advice. My advice is to show the leadership, because we know what is that needs to be done. We know a lot of what are those decisions are that need to be made to make the transition to clean energy happen. But there's just that leadership that's needed to do it. And I know it's a cliche, but it is really also what it comes down to.
Thank you, Philip. And speaking of leadership, I want to close today with final remarks from Undersecretary Lopez, who can share with us his thoughts across this panel and this wonderful discussion. Over to you, Francisco, Undersecretary Lopez.
Thank you, Helen. It's very enriching to listen to Dani's experience and especially knowledge from Ambassador Anker. Also to hear the vision of Mr. Martul that help us to know how to attract investment in the energy sector. The study presented by Jennifer and Philippe is a great input to the public and private sector in order to reinforce the role that both sectors have in the energy transition process. Thanks to World Resource Institute and Ørsted for your presentations. Elvia and experience of Brazil in renewable journey and how to follow the route to a low carbon economy and the regulatory change are also very enriching. In Chile, we set the course into an ambitious plan to reach carbon neutrality by 2050. In its heart and as a key player, it's the energy sector which will be responsible for an estimate of 50% of the CO2 reduction to reach that goal. To achieve it will require several investment in the energy transitions, nor the private sector by itself or nor the public sector could make it without collaboration between them. Today, we heard across all the panels a reinforcing discussion into this subject, pointing out that associatively it will be possible to succeed in our climate goals. The study presented by the World Resources Institute and Ørsted further presents clear examples of how us governments could foster the private investment in the energy transitions. In our experience in Chile, we have positive results in line with the key findings of the study. For example, we have the long-term energy planning process led by our ministry, and its main objective is to prospectively the cultures for energy over a 30-year horizon, recognizing the importance of identifying sustainable geographics and areas for the development of renewable energy throughout Chile in a manner to correct plan for the requirement transmission lines and grid infrastructure. Furthermore, we are currently implementing clean energy initiatives to develop green hydrogen projects in our country, as we have $50 million US facility for direct funding support in large-scale green H2 production projects. And as we up to 27% of the required emissions reductions to become carbon neutrality by 2050 are expected to be derived from the use of green H2 in various sectors. I hope that our experience and discussion held today and during all this week led us to closer in enabling the collaboration needed, as more important will lead us into the required action to achieve our climate goal. SEM and MI is an excellent opportunity to put in common, to share experience, to learn from other institutions, countries, and to advance in a sustainable global development. Through our history, there are several examples where we are able to surpass extreme difficulties that were considered unattainable at this moment. However, they are achieved through a human collaboration, willingness, and commitment into ambitious goals. Today, we face ever greater challenges, and the climate crisis will definitely be more severe and more specific. Nevertheless, we have a greater opportunity to take it through collaboration and ambition. Thank you very much for your participation and for this very important panel.
Thank you so much, Undersecretary Lopez. Thank you so much to Chile for your leadership, and to all our fantastic panelists who've shared with us today the insights on how to actually shift global finance to support this clean energy transition. Thank you all, and onwards to actually achieve this shift in the investment. Thank you.